episode, so to speak, of the Cognitive Ontology seminar, and we have a keynote speaker, Jackie Sullivan, talking to us about cognitive ontologies, epistemic communities, and coordinated pluralism. And at 3:30 on Friday, Pete economist Lisa Westerlund will be talking in the annual lecture series about gender differences in task allocations, competition, and volunteering. You're all invited to any of these talks. If you're interested, just go to the website of the center, look for the calendar, and you can register for any of these Zoom talks. We're using Zoom webinar, so most of you are attendees. If you have a question, go to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and write your name. And during the Q&A, I will promote you to the status of panelist. And I'll leave it at that. Adina, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Edward. So welcome to the Cognitive Ontology series. Our first talk today will be from Brian Bruya. He is a professor of philosophy in the philosophy section of Eastern Michigan University in the Department of History and Philosophy, and a center associate in the University of Michigan's Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies. He's actually going to be visiting us from the National Taiwan University, where he is a visiting scholar right now, and it is the middle of the night where he is, so we have to thank him for his dedication to this set of talks. His specialties are in Chinese philosophy, comparative philosophy, philosophy of action, and philosophical psychology. And his talk is entitled Diverse Origins of Cognitive Ontology. So thank you very much, Brian, for sticking with us through the middle of the night, and we're looking forward to your talk.
Great, thank you for the introduction. I'll see if I can share my screen here.
To be working, yes.
Okay, are you seeing I think you're probably seeing the presenter view, right?
Yeah.
All right, let me see if I can get out of that. And go to I practiced this at the beginning and I didn't master it yet. Still not working. Sorry about that.
I don't know that it's. I don't know if that it's possible. I don't know if it's possible for you to see the presenter view and us to see the slideshow.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm trying to get out of the presenter view. Okay, sorry. Let's try again. Screen one. Let me see if I can just end the presenter view.
We don't see the presenter view now.
Oh, good. Oh, that worked. Okay. All right, we can begin. So first, a small apology for not attending the other events so far. As Adina said, I'm in Taiwan, which makes the time difference a bit difficult. When they were afternoon sessions, it was 1 a.m. here. This kind of hits the sweet spot. It's only 10 p.m. here. And starting on Sunday, it will be 11 p.m. here. I hope to make some of the future talks. So this is a talk on the diverse origins of cognitive ontology. And the way I'd like to approach this is to tell you a story, essentially give you one data point of anecdotal evidence. It occurred to me when I was preparing the talk that maybe talking to philosophers of science and giving one data point of anecdotal evidence is not the best idea. But I'll try to convince you, or at least persuade you of a certain point of view, namely that it's worth considering non-Western philosophy when it comes to thinking about possibilities for constructing a robust cognitive ontology. Just to make sure we're on the same page here, see if I can adjust my slide. There we go. So my understanding of an ontology is that it's a systematic set of concepts that are interrelated and that are represented by words, terminology, semantically interrelated, and that these words can be, and sets of words can be taken out and used for certain purposes, such as in cognition. Here are some examples that I understand are ideas and terms that are part of our current cognitive ontology. Of course, what neuroscientists have been doing for the last 30 or so years is seeing if it's possible to associate these terms from folk psychology with areas of the brain. One thing I like to point out, if you look at the bottom two items there, creativity and stress, these terms have really, even though they're very current today and it's hard to imagine a robust cognitive ontology without them, they've only been around about 100 years or even less. And so when we think of folk psychology, we often think that it is a set of ideas that are just there, but it's constantly changing. Some of them go way back, as I'm going to intimate later in the talk, and are infused with psychological philosophical presuppositions, and some are more recent. So the question I'm asking in this talk is, could our current cognitive ontology be subject to confirmation bias or resistant to contrasting alternatives? And I think the obvious answer to this is yes. Our ontology could be subject to confirmation bias. I'm sure many, if not all of you, are familiar with the implicit bias project at Harvard and how it has shown that even very smart, very sophisticated people are not immune to certain cognitive biases. So it just makes sense that as we're thinking about the terms and concepts that go into our cognitive ontology, that we may be subject to these kinds of biases. We may see things that look familiar and say, yeah, that's got to be right. We may come across things that look unfamiliar and say, that can't be right. Or maybe not even consider things that look unfamiliar. In this talk, I'm going to give a story about my own background and one particular term in cognitive ontology, just to show you the possibilities that looking beyond our familiar landscape can provide. I'm going to motivate that project real quickly with the notions of the self in Buddhist psychology. I'm sure many people listening right now are familiar with some aspects of Buddhist psychology, especially the notion of an-atman, that there is no such thing as a substantial self in Buddhist psychology. But that's not to say there's no concept of the self in Buddhist psychology. In fact, the concept is quite complex. And what I'm suggesting here is, if you think for a second about your own conception of what the self is, right? If you had to write down right now the components of the self, what would you write down? And what I'd like to think about is how they might differ real quickly from the concepts in the Buddhist, let's call it the ontology of the self. Rupa is matter, which would obviously to us cash out as the nervous system. Vedana is translated as feelings. Sanya is translated as perception. Shankara is translated as thoughts, and Vijnana is translated as consciousness. Now, obviously, all of these things look familiar to us. It just so happens that none of them actually map on to our traditional conceptions of these terms in English. And two of them in particular are problematic and revealing. So feelings we might think of as emotions, but in Buddhist psychology, there are only three. One is pleasant, one is unpleasant, and one is neutral. And the idea here is that whatever circumstances you're in at any particular time, those circumstances will be experienced as pleasant, unpleasant, or neither. And that experience, that feeling, will be motivational. If you're in a pleasant circumstance, then you'll want to repeat that situation. If it's unpleasant, it will be experienced as aversive, and you'll want to not repeat it. So the idea of feelings have a sort of time course built into it that we don't necessarily see when we see the word feelings in English. Something similar happens in the notion of Shankara, which translated as thoughts sounds very familiar, translated slightly more with more detail as predisposed and predisposing intentional thought acts, also suggests that whatever's happening at the moment is coming from somewhere and is leading to somewhere. When we think of intentional acts as being willed, traditionally in rationalist philosophy, we see the free will as coming from our own thought processes, but is entirely free, and we can choose anything we'd like to choose. The Buddhist psychology is that that's not even possible, that a thought, an action is always coming from somewhere. It just so happens that kar there in Shankara is the same root as karma. And so Shankara really is a karmic thought act. So my purpose here is not to go into detail about Buddhist psychology, but just to say that the way, when we think of cognitive ontology as carving nature at its joints, maybe nature doesn't have joints that we can carve it at, or maybe other traditions can show us some joints that maybe we didn't see before. The idea being that our current cognitive ontology may be very different from the way that in a sense, it's just contingent on the background, the philosophical background from which we come. So that's the motivation. The story that I'd like to tell begins in 2005 when Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, Martin Seligman, Ed Diener, Chris Peterson, and George Valiant got a grant from one of the big early grants from the Templeton Foundation in order to kick off the field of positive psychology. They held a 6-week summer conference at the University of Pennsylvania, and they put out a call for participants, and I was accepted as I was just a freshly minted PhD, but was accepted as a so-called senior fellow at this conference. And in the mornings, we spent all day together every day for 6 weeks. And in the mornings, we would get together and brainstorm about one of 5 projects. The project that I was on with Mike was about obviously flow and autotelic experience. And then in the afternoons, we would go and do research about things that we brainstormed. And I got it in my head that I would try to find out all the objective evidence I could about flow. He came out with his first book on flow in 1975. This was 2005, so I thought in the intervening 40 years, there must be a lot of cognitive psychology work that had been done on flow. I looked high and low using all the resources at the University of Pennsylvania Library, and I found virtually nothing about the cognitive science of flow, which I found stunning, frankly. The work that Csikszentmihalyi had done, he's an empirical psychologist and had plenty of evidence to explain what flow is, but all of it was based on subjective surveys. And he would ask people how they felt in a particular moment, but nobody had tried to subject people in a laboratory to standard experiments or to some creative experiments to try to study what flow was in terms of neuropsychology. So this got me thinking that, well, first I was intrigued, but also a little bit confused. And then in my research, I found out one of the sticking points might be the way that attention had been conceptualized. In 1973, Daniel Kahneman published a book called Attention and Effort, which was the culmination of over a decade of research by him and many other cognitive psychologists on attention. And Kahneman's conclusion, which wasn't an outlier, was that attention just is effort, that they're identical. Wherever you have attention, you have effort, and wherever you have mental effort, you have attention. So if somebody wanted to study something like flow, which is a kind of effortless attention, it would be a non-starter. It just didn't fit into the cognitive ontology. Kahneman, this is my graph, but this is my description of how Kahneman conceived attention as effortful. It has the demands on the x-axis there. As the demands increase, effort increases along with it until no more effort can be given by a person at asymptotes. Again, this is my depiction of what Kahneman's theory was. And if you think about your own intuitions about effort, I think it's probably not far off if we think about somebody doing math problems or homework and they're putting in effort, it will be experienced as effortful. We have lots of sayings about effort, some which are motivational. And if you think about somebody like Immanuel Kant and his theory of ethics, that if somebody is trying to be ethical, it's more worthy than somebody who is nice just by nature. The idea of attention as effort seems to be built in to our ontology that we've inherited in the West. So continuing with my story here, I decided to do as much research as I could around the edges of attentional theory to see what people had been doing that might look like effortless attention. I hired a research assistant who was a PhD in psychology, and together we researched the field, and I drew up essentially a book proposal, and I sent it around to a few dozen cognitive scientists, none of whom I knew personally, and got quite a bit of uptake on the idea. And in 2010, Bradford Books at MIT Press came out with the book Effortless Attention. This is an example, I'm suggesting, of altering partially the current cognitive ontology, where attention was conceptualized as necessarily effortful. This book tried to expand the notion of attention to include effortless attention. If you think of a dictionary as a repository of current cognitive ontology, the APA Dictionary of Psychology included an entry on effortless attention a couple years after the book came out. I've tried to expand the notion of effortless attention into the realm of philosophy of action, and I capitalized on a notion in science of self-organization, trying to conceptualize human action as arising not from a vanishing point of the will, but thinking about the multimodal mind, thinking that there is a self-organization process involved, and that this could be a way to conceptualize action as an alternative. So that appears in a book called The Philosophical Challenge from China, also edited by me, also published by MIT Press. This book, so I'm giving you my story of the place of effortless attention in the current cognitive ontology. This book features quite a number of other chapters from people working in Chinese philosophy, and also introducing ideas from the Chinese tradition into current philosophical theory, including quite a few chapters on moral psychology. So I'm not a lone voice out there. There are others trying to do similar things. More recently, I've worked with Tang Yiyuan, a cognitive scientist who has a chair professorship in psychology at Texas Tech. And we drew up a thorough critique of Kahneman's book, trying to lay out exactly what was wrong with it and future steps for maybe thinking more clearly about attention and effort. I'd like to take a bit of a detour here for a moment and introduce you to an idea from Scott Page. Scott Page is a political scientist at the University of Michigan. He's done, you may have heard of him, he's done quite a bit of work on the topic of diversity, particularly what he calls cognitive diversity. Now we're all familiar with identity diversity. That has to do with our ethnic background, our cultural background, our sexual identity, and so on. It's not unrelated to cognitive diversity, but there also isn't a necessary relation between identity diversity and cognitive diversity. So Page says that, well, maybe the best thing is I'll just read the title of the talk there at the bottom. That kind of says it all. The title of the article here that he published with Lu Hong is "Groups of Diverse Problem Solvers Can Outperform Groups of High Ability Problem Solvers." Meaning that if you have a group of people working on a really hard problem, your first instinct is probably to get the smartest people together in a room. But according to Page and Hong, if you have the same kind of people working on the problem, they're all going to come up with more or less the same answer. But if you have different backgrounds, people who can bring different perspectives and different heuristics to the problem, then your chances of solving it increase. So if you can think of, I was just thinking when I was preparing this, suppose the University of Pittsburgh took Scott Page's theory seriously and said, well, we don't just want the smartest people in our program, we want people from across the cultural spectrum. And I don't just mean that in terms of ethnicity. What I'm suggesting is that there are repositories in the academy of people who study 3,000 years of Chinese philosophy, 3,000 years of Indian philosophy. And these people, these cultures have some very smart people who've thought very hard about the problems of humanity. And it's like a repository of what Page says here, perspectives and heuristics. And the point of my talk here is, I'm wondering why we ignore these perspectives when we're building something like a cognitive ontology, or wondering about the really hard problems of cognitive ontology, and what might be gained by exploring these different cultures in more depth. So again, the example I'm giving here today is how I've done that. So what I've presented you with so far is the results of what I've done. And I haven't yet mentioned, and will now mention, where that comes from. So like Adina said, my background is in Chinese philosophy. And especially a classic Chinese text called the Zhuangzi. This text is not originally illustrated. I'm just presenting a comic book version of it here because it's very clever and interesting. What I did is I tried to, if you read through the Zhuangzi, it won't be obvious what the cognitive ontology is in it. But for my dissertation, what I did is I tried to reconstruct some of the key conceptual aspects of attention and action in the Zhuangzi, because it looked to me different from the way we were conceptualizing attention and action traditionally in the West. And I wanted to see what those differences might be and if they might be important. So I found 4 basic notions of attention or action in the Zhuangzi. And I'll just illustrate them here through these 4 stories quickly. One is the story of a guy whose profession is catching cicadas. And he says in the second panel of the episode there, despite the expansiveness of the world and the multitude of things in it, all I see are the cicada wings, and nothing else can distract me from them. So one element, and this is just one example of many such stories, one element of attention is high concentration. This is not something surprising, but it's one of the 4 elements I found. The other is the elimination of distractions. So an artisan who constructs bell stands, he talks about how he dismisses thoughts of payment, and then thoughts of his reputation, and then thoughts even of his own body. Number 3, responsiveness to circumstances. So here we start to get to some quite interesting aspects of attention. A swimmer who can swim in roiling water says, it's second nature for me. I go in with the eddies and out with the swells, following the flow of the water instead of my own will. And then finally, somebody describes his skill in terms of ease of execution, which is just the opposite of what we might expect of somebody who's highly concentrating on somebody in the traditional sense of attention as effort. So the 4 elements that were extracted in this taxonomy of attention are high concentration, that's attention, eliminating distractions, responsiveness to circumstances, and ease of execution. So if we go back to Kahneman's, the graph of Kahneman's notion of effort, attention as effortful, we can adjust it, and it will look something like this. The demands may increase, but at some point, effort will decrease or level off at a point where the demands can still be met. This is a quite different way to look at attention from the traditional way. All right, so my point here is that maybe having around these different ideas from different traditions can help us with our cognitive ontology. It's interesting that in the research on attention, the notion that we could make a distinction between objective effort and subjective effort rarely ever came up. I mean, I think it seems pretty obvious if we think about physical effort, that we can reduce subjective effort by using pulleys and so on. But we rarely think of reducing subjective effort in mental tasks through some ways. But if we think of things like games and sports, where we can work at a very high level of attention even, but sometimes they can come off as effortless. People talk often about being in the zone, for example. So this can have implications beyond just cognitive ontology. I'm sure you all have an understanding of what we're doing in trying to build a cognitive ontology is not just conceptual and not just abstract, but it can have ramifications outside of the academy. The number of children diagnosed with ADHD is increasing every year. Now, the A of ADHD, of course, is attention, and many of those children are medicated. So what if we have the notion of attention wrong? Or what if we have misconstrued it, or we've missed an important dimension of attention? Could it be that our medical diagnoses and our medical treatments are affected by that? And if you look at the definitions of ADHD and how it is diagnosed, it looks very familiar, very similar to what Kahneman's definition of that attention necessarily involves effort. And when they do cognitive scientific studies of children and even diagnostic tests, this is an example of one. There's a cute little face here, which is inviting for the person taking the test. But it doesn't look like a very fun test. It's not something that would attract your interest. And it has occurred to some scientists, although still a minority, that attention deficit may not be a deficit of attention, but a deficit of motivation. That children have a problem paying attention to boring things. They don't have a problem paying attention per se. And some clever psychologists tried a different kind of cognitive test, namely the game Frogger, and put children through their paces to see how well they could pay attention playing a game. This is me playing Frogger. And they found something quite interesting. They said this study showed no difference between the inhibitory performance of children with ADHD compared to typically developing children on 2 commercially available computer games. And then they go on to say, but there was a difference when they did computer tasks. So it's worth wondering whether attention deficit is a deficit of something we call voluntary attention, but maybe something we call post-voluntary attention remains intact. I haven't explained what post-voluntary attention is yet. This is a term that probably none of you have heard of unless you grew up in Russia or China and studied psychology there, because it's a term that arose in Russia in the 20s and 30s and 40s. I guess it's 30s through 50s, something like that. So we have a standard distinction of attention as involuntary attention, attention drawn by external stimulus. If there's a loud sound and you turn your head, that's an involuntary draw to attention. Voluntary attention is attention directed towards a goal. It's something we're trying to pay attention to. These are our standard ways of talking about attention in psychology today. In Russia, they have a third kind of attention that Dobrynin came up with called post-voluntary attention. If you think of playing a game, at the beginning, when you're just learning the rules, you have to pay attention. You have to pay voluntary attention to it to try to learn the rules and try to understand where everything goes and how to get ahead and win. After a while, you get good at it and it becomes more habitual. This he calls post-voluntary attention. I think a lot of times when we think of automation and attention or automatic attention, we think of it as where our mind just wanders, but we can still do an activity. That's not what's being talked about here in post-voluntary attention or in flow. I think it's really crucial when you're thinking about this concept to understand that there's a high level of attention, but it's not experienced as effortful. So we can talk more about this later, but this is an idea that Ian and I are working on, trying to think about how it can be relevant to education today and how, again, maybe post-voluntary attention can enter our cognitive ontology. And that's the end.
All right, thank you very much. One of the downsides, as I always say, of Zoom webinar is that we can't really clap. There is no clapping function. So for the attendee, please, if you have a question, write your name in the Q&A. Click on the Q&A button, write your name, and I'll promote you to the status of a panelist so that you can ask your question to Brian directly. We've got a bit more than 10, 12 minutes or something like that for Q&A. Vincent, I'll promote you right ahead.
Should I read these or is somebody else going to read them?
Yeah. Vincent, the floor is yours, and then Adina.
Okay. All right. All right. Thank you, Edouard. Thank you, Brian, for a wonderful talk. I just wanted to ask you if you looked at in your research on attention this idea of processing fluency or perceptual fluency. I'm thinking of work by Rolf Reber that I looked at in the realm of aesthetics. So he has this nice paper on processing or perceptual fluency that is linked to or strongly correlated with aesthetic pleasure. And so he has a view about this, and I wonder if that might connect somehow to your idea of effortless attention. Just curious.
There is quite a bit of work done on reading skills and fluency in reading and attention that seem partially relevant, but I never did find a way to connect it as conceptualized through the notion of effortlessness. And you bring up the notion of pleasure. I'm not familiar with this research, and I'd be interested in reading about it because in addition to extending the idea of effortless attention from Chinese philosophy to cognition and to philosophy of action, I have another paper that I'm working on called on aesthetics specifically. I'm trying to reconceptualize the arts. If you think about it, some arts rely on a kind of fluidity of motion. I think that's what you're talking about there. And some don't, because some are right in the moment, like dance, and some can happen over time, serially and consecutively. I'm thinking specifically of Chinese calligraphy, where the brushstroke is evident on the page. The time course of it is evident on the page, and when you appreciate Chinese calligraphy, you look at it as if you're following the brush. So there's a certain immediacy to it that you don't have in some art. You do have it in some art. You have it in dance. You have it in, for instance, jazz music, a lot of live musical performance. And what I'm wondering is if that fluency of the live or even recorded, like on calligraphy paper, if that distinguishes one kind of art from another. So the answer, I guess, to your question is yes and no. I'm not familiar with that specific body of work, but I'm interested in something that's along those lines.
All right, thank you. I'll send you the papers.
Great,
thanks, Vincent. Adina, floor is yours.
Thanks. Thanks for that talk. That was super interesting. I guess I'm trying to distill what you might think of as the overarching lesson. I mean, one thing you might take from this is that taking intuitions from many different cultures, approaches might enrich our cognitive ontologies. Another thing you might think is, oh my God, if we're all getting these quite different answers, what are the prospects of hitting on the right cognitive ontology? And I guess I'm wondering whether you are an optimist about cognitive ontology, and if you are, what you think the criteria are for deciding between different candidate ontologies.
Yeah, that's a good question. I was just talking to my students yesterday, suggesting that my own perspective is I'm a bit of a pragmatist about it, and I think that there is the prospect that our empirical research can be profitable to us, but we can never think that it is the last word. And the best we can do is to continue developing it and working with it and trying new ideas and questioning our current ideas. That's my perspective on it. So I don't think there's necessarily a correct answer that we'll come to and say, yes, we've got it. But I think that the empirical research we do is not entirely relative to the concepts that we're working with, that there is some traction between our concepts and the empirical world.
Yeah, I mean, if I can follow up on Adina's question, because I had a very similar thought. I was in a way struck by the difference between what I've been doing in the domain of cross-cultural research, not necessarily in cross-cultural philosophy, but in cross-cultural empirical work, cross-cultural psychology, and what you are doing. And I'm much more inspired by Adina's second line of thought, I find diversity in the way we're conceptualizing a topic that immediately raise skeptical worries for me about our grasp of the topic, that it is actually extremely hard to have an objectively grounded grasp of the topic, right? So if I find tremendous variation in the way people are conceptualizing epistemic concepts, knowledge, justification, then I have immediately skeptical worries about our grasp of that domain. And there's many ways of fleshing out this intuition, one might say, in more philosophically sophisticated terms. But you have the opposite reaction drawn by this research on diversity, right? So you have a debate with different perspectives, and somehow there's a hope that we're going to get it right. So I find actually this really diametrically opposed take on the benefits of diversity. That was, I just like Adina, I was actually struck by that contrast.
Give you a different perspective, maybe. So Chinese, you can, here in Taipei, if you have some kind of illness, you can go to what we would call a Western medical center, or you can go to a Chinese medicine doctor who will treat you. And what's really interesting about this is that they're totally different. They're both dealing with the human body, the physical human body, but they have totally different ontologies of diagnosis, of prognosis, of the systems of the body, and how the functions work together. And they're all out there parallel right now in society. And you can go to one doctor and get a totally different response, a different set of medicines, a different set of treatments, and conceptualize in a different way for the feelings that you're having of an illness. I've thought about this a lot with some of my students, especially a student of mine who's a nurse and is studying Chinese and trying to wrap his head around how we can have two parallel fields of medicine simultaneously working together that see the world in a different way. So maybe you're right. Maybe we should be skeptical, and maybe we don't just need diverse sources of ontology. Maybe we need diverse sets of ontologies. That would be very interesting.
Thanks. We have time for maybe one last question. If someone wants to add something. No. Then we will leave it at that. Thanks, Brian, for this really wonderful lecture. I very much liked it. And we're going to move to the next lecture. And Adina, I'll let you take the lead from here.
Great. So our next lecture is Dr. Julia Haas. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy and in the neuroscience program at Rhodes College. She's also a research affiliate in the project called Humanizing Machine Intelligence Grand Challenge, run by the Australian National University. In 2019, she was a research fellow at the School of Philosophy at the ANU, and she was also a McDonald postdoctoral fellow before that in the Philosophy, Neuroscience, Psychology, or PNP program at Washington University in St. Louis. Her research is in the philosophy of cognitive science and neuroscience, and she works on the nature of valuation and its role in theories of the mind. Her current work concerns prospects for genuinely moral artificial intelligence. So we're really happy to welcome Julia Haas to our speaker series, and her talk is entitled Computational Cognitive Ontology.
Julia, you should unmute yourself.
Yeah, we can't hear you, Julia. And we were seeing, there we go. Now you're on.
Better? So thanks, Adina, for that. Yeah, very quickly, my talk today is going to be about how we can inform and hopefully revise our existing cognitive ontologies. So kind of actually having a lot in common with what Brian was suggesting there. Much of the recent literature on cognitive ontology proposes some form of cognitive ontological splitting. So for example, The neural reuse hypothesis, of course, proposes that different brain regions recombine to support performance across many different kinds of tasks. So the idea is one region, multiple functions. The functional heterogeneity hypothesis proposes that the brain contains actually different types of multifunctional parts. So splitting of splitting, right? And of course, many of these splitting approaches are following the money, if you will. They're responding to very meaningful evidence that there are kind of complex systems of organization in the brain, and they're trying to track that. Nonetheless, what I'm going to suggest today is that we need ways of putting things back together for all the reasons that standard taxonomies are just useful in general, establishing the domain or scope of a given explanandum, coordinating our vocabularies, our methods, our interpretations. And if you think of scientific knowledge or the pursuit of scientific knowledge as kind of the web of knowledge, right, or theoretical consilience and methodological consilience, taxonomies can kind of provide way stations or waypoints, providing, even if only temporary, bases for kind of holding some parts of that web constant and then revising or eliminating other parts of that web of knowledge, of our interrelated constructs. And my aim today is, as I mentioned, to provide one such way of putting things back together. Notably by taxonomizing certain classes of computational solution as they guide our various traditional cognitive capacities. So the general aim of my talk is premised on two much more specific claims. The first is an ontological claim. The first is that the brain conserves certain computational solutions across.
Julia, you just cut out.
Yeah, you froze. Oops.
Yep.
Yeah.
Julia, I think we lost you.
Yeah, let me email her. I'll chat her. Oh, she's probably going to join us again. We apologize for these technical issues. My first, I don't know whether there's a technical term for Zoom problem or something like that. The first time that happens to me.
Zoom boom.
Yeah, something like that. All right. I've emailed her. I don't have her phone number, sadly. Bear with us for a minute, as I'm pretty sure she will join us, except of course if it's a more serious issue with her internet. Let's wait for a couple of minutes before making a decision.
Yeah, and I'll see. No, I don't have a phone number for her.
I have a phone number for her.
Yeah.
Let me email Alex. Maybe Alex has a phone number.
There she is.
She's back.
Can you hear us, Julia?
I'm back.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
We lost you.
Zoom just crashed. Apologies for that. So we'll just kind of resume where we were. So basically, blah, 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 intro. Punchline, there's a new way of doing this. The ontological claim is there are computations that the mind uses again and again to solve seemingly different kinds of problems. Ontological claim, methodological claim, we can use these instances of what I'm going to call computational conservation to revise our cognitive capacities, to kind of hold the computations constant, revise our intuitions about our cognitive capacities. This might kind of draw back to some of the discussion in response to Brian's talk. And then if we can revise our understanding of those capacities, then we can also potentially revise the cognitive ontologies that we build out of those capacities. So really quickly, the plan. As Adina mentioned, much of my work is on the nature of valuation. So I'm going to suggest that valuation is one such computational solution that the mind uses to solve various kinds of problems. So I'm going to proceed basically by case study, looking at valuation, and then try in the second section of my talk to draw out the nature of what I'm then going to identify as computational conservation. And then the third part of my talk, illustrate how we can use this computational conservation or reuse to start revising one example of a cognitive capacity, actually attention. So our two talks go together very nicely, looking at how we can use our understanding of evaluation to revise or refine our understandings of attention, and then use that to potentially move forward with our cognitive ontologies. So quickly here, there's now been a couple of decades of research stemming from computer science asking how an agent can learn to optimize its behavior strictly by learning through interactions with its environment, right? So take the baby plover here. Baby plovers are born, and within a matter of hours, they can walk, they can fly, they can seek out food and water, and they can avoid predation. And with all due respect here to the parent plover in your diagram, right, the baby plover does this without any parental supervision or training. So they learn strictly through bumping around in the world. And the question is, for this branch of learning, which starts out in reinforcement learning and then kind of broadens out to the decision sciences, how do we do this? How do agents like the plover do this? How do systems do this? How do humans do this? And a very kind of preliminary answer to this question has been that agents learn through interaction. Baby plover, and again, this kind of ties in a little bit with what Brian was saying, the baby plover interacts with the world and notes certain experiences as being a little bit better, you know, being rewarding, being valuable, and returning to those, approaching those kinds of experiences in the future. Other kinds of experiences are costly or punishing, and those are to be withdrawn from or avoided. Now, here, reward and value are technical terms. So reward refers to the intrinsic desirability of a given stimulus. So for me, and probably for many of us, a cup of coffee is something that is intrinsically desirable, not in the platonic sense, but it's intrinsically desirable to me. I enjoy it. And this helps us contrast with value. So I'm currently in Canada. It's very dark and very cold. I have to get out of bed in the morning to make my cup of coffee. I have to put the kettle on and all of these things. None of these things, I assure you, are rewarding in the slightest, right? It's miserable. But nevertheless, these states that I describe are valuable because they lead to the state or the state action pair that is rewarding. So it's a two-place relation, things that are just rewarding, and then much of what we do is valuable because it leads to these rewarding stimuli or states of affairs. So this is typically in reinforcement learning described in mathematical and computational terms. So reward functions and value functions of various kinds. So not only in reinforcement learning. And what I argue and have argued is that we can now kind of draw out these mathematical models and characterize what I call valuation. So I define valuation as the subpersonal attribution of goal and context-dependent subjective reward and value to either interoceptive and exteroceptive stimuli. And I always say, look, this is a disgusting definition, and it is, but we have kind of the key ingredients here already, right? So we have subjective reward and value attribution. All subpersonal is doing here is to note that it's a causal rather than a personal level or intentional mechanism. So we don't have things like our social values in mind when we say value here. This is something that the mind is doing kind of continually and causally. Goal and context dependent, right? So coffee is rewarding to me because it tastes nice, but it also is rewarding to me because it helps me wake up in the morning. That means that when my context changes late at night, when I want to go to bed, coffee is deadly, right? And it's no longer rewarding. So these rewards and values are heavily goal dependent and context dependent. And finally, interoceptive and exteroceptive stimuli are just meant to be as broad as possible here. So I've argued previously that humans at least attribute value not only to states of affairs and state action pairs as kind of put forward in the reinforcement learning literature, but also to objects, to commodities. I find apples rewarding, but not oranges, as well as to kind of interoceptive states of affairs, to internal milieu, as well as to abstract ideas. Certain countries in North America, for example, place a high degree of value or even reward on the notion of patriotism or freedom. That's something that separates us perhaps from other kinds of animals that also use the valuational system. Now, as I mentioned, these characterizations originate in mathematical or computational accounts in reinforcement learning, but of course, over the past several decades, we've just had huge bodies of evidence suggesting that valuation does take place in minds like ours and in the human mind. So we have computational, cellular, and system neuroscientific evidence, primarily looking at the dopaminergic system or the reward pathways in the mind as you kind of move out in grain or scope, but also cognitive neuroscientific and neuroeconomic evidence suggesting that valuation underwrites our willingness to pay, our wanting, our economic decision making, as well as evidence from comparative and cognitive psychology. So behavioral evidence that kind of pairs nicely with the prevalence of valuation in the mind. Now, I'm happy to say much more about the empirical evidence in the Q&A, but I think for the purposes of my talk, the more important question is, how does this allow us to understand valuation and what it's actually doing in the mind? And what we find is that perhaps contrary to its origins in reinforcement, where should I go for food or what should I do? Behavior selection. Once you start looking, you realize that valuation is actually sort of ubiquitous in the mind and solves all kinds of problems. High level cognitive problems like behavior selection, but also very low level problems, such as the one I have here, visual fixation, right? So visual fixation is the problem of where to look. We know that humans are very good at looking at the right thing at the right time in the right order. The example that you have here on the left is an eye tracking task where the participant is asked to make a PB&J, peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And what you see here is actually kind of interesting, right? They're not attending to the very salient tablecloth at all, right? What would otherwise be considered very salient tablecloth, the red and white checker pattern, they're just looking at the plate, at the bread, at the knife, at the peanut butter, and they're looking at all the right things at the right time and in the right order. And for a long time, we've often that for particular tasks, especially expert tasks like driving or playing soccer professionally or things like that. And it turns out that valuation does in fact guide where we look and when, so it guides our saccadic eye movement. And you'll kind of see how that comes together when you think about how infants, when they're first born, right, they kind of look at as there's nothing really meaningfully interestingly guiding their visual fixation or their saccadic eye movements, but you'll see a very distinctive pattern happen across almost all children, which is that they start to fixate to the source of food, and they'll work backwards to start to value and fixate the sources of the food, i.e. the parents' faces, right? So food and then parents, and then to the broader world where we start to look at things because of the reward and value that we've overlain in the world. We look at the things that, depending on what we're doing and what context we're in, are valuable or rewarding. And so we kind of have these fabrics and those guide where we look. And you also see the corresponding disruptions. Individuals who have disruptions in their valuational systems also have very discernible pathologies in visual fixation and eye tracking and so on. So once you start to look, once you make the discovery that valuation pops up in the unexpected place of something like sensation, where we weren't expecting, you start to look for it in other places. And then it pops up all over. So rewarded percepts that we see in perspective memory. How do we remember or fail to remember things that we need to do in the future? Reward and value play a role. Of course, the kind of locus classicus decision making. And we can kind of also extend the role of valuation in moral decision making. So these very kind of sophisticated questions of what do we kind of intuitively think is right and wrong looks to be guided by valuation. And what we can kind of start to think then is that we have a characterization of how valuation works. It works through the attribution of reward and value. We kind of have these complex mechanisms of saying, hey, that was better than I expected, that was worse than I expected, and kind of have these running tallies of reward and value mapped onto the world. But we can also generalize a bit and say, here's how it does it, and here's what it's for. So I argue that the function of valuation is to guide selection, not just in behavior, but more broadly between competing states of affairs. And generalizing this function in this way, and seeing that it gets implicated in all kinds of cognitive capacities, starts to hint to us that, hey, valuation is a solution that works well, and that the mind deploys again and again to solve all kinds of selection problems, ranging from visual fixation, very low level tasks of, where should I look and what should I see, all the way to more sophisticated tasks like what should I order in the restaurant, how should I make my decision about my future, what do I think is right and wrong, right? So kind of a brief kind of move through the case study, but what I now want to do is use the example of valuation to suggest something about computational conservation. So I mentioned at the outset a very nice paper on multifunctional heterogeneity by Joe McCaffrey, and in that paper he characterizes some of the kinds of multifunctionality that we can see in the brain, and he gives us this account of componential conservation. So componential conservation occurs when multifunctional components have conserved roles, which is to say that they perform the same role or operation phi in different capacities, psi 1, psi 2, psi 3. So Joe's example for this is the Leach motor neuron circuit. So the role here is controlling rhythm, right? And then it performs this capacity, it performs this role rather in multiple capacities. So in swimming, in crawling, and so on. So you have the component, and the component is conserved, performing its role in very different kinds of capacities. Now, I want to help myself to this idea to characterize what I call computational conservation. So I argue that computational conservation occurs insofar as some computations C have conserved roles. That is, they perform the same role or operation, phi, in different cognitive processes, psi 1, psi 2, psi 3. Now, this will come as a huge reveal to all of you that, of course, my example here is going to be valuation, right? So our computation is going to be valuation. The role in question is the one we specified, our function. So the selection between competing states of affairs, and the cognitive processes here, some of the ones that we might mention are visual fixation, perception, attention, perspective, memory, and so on, right? So this is hypothetically what computational conservation would look like. And of course, this allows me to move to the slightly stronger ontological claim that I want to establish, which is that the brain, in fact, does this, right? The brain, in fact, conserves computational solutions in at least one instance, valuation, such that these computations perform the same role or operation in different cognitive processes. Now, this is kind of a pretty thin way of putting computational conservation on the table, but I think we can kind of enrich our understanding by looking at what computational conservation is not saying, or contrasting it with other views in the general vicinity of trying to build our cognitive ontologies using computation. So we'll have a kind of short compare and contrast in the literature. The first contrast that I want to draw is between computational conservation and canonical computation. Computational conservation and canonical computation. So Dan Bernstein has a very nice discussion of canonical computations in his paper from last year. The basic idea in canonical computations is that there are certain computations that are used in every brain unit, every functional brain unit in the mind. So an example of a canonical computation here would be something like summation or normalization. And of course, here you can kind of see that computational conservation is a much weaker claim, right? We're not saying valuation is implicated in every brain structure or every kind of functional unit of the brain. I'm making kind of an empirical claim about its ubiquity, but nothing nearly as strong or fundamental as the canonical computation. So canonical computation is much stronger, weaker claim here in computational conservation. Conversely, I think computational conservation says something a little bit different or stronger than what's put forward by Shine, Poljack, and colleagues when they characterize computational specificity. So computational specificity is basically akin to neural or functional specificity in the brain. So this question of how many computations does a given brain structure support? There's going to be some that have a high degree of specificity, for example, perhaps early in the visual system, right, where there's almost a one-to-one relation between brain structure and computation, and then other brain structures which are less specified, less specialized, they're going to host multiple computations, perhaps again lower down in the visual system. And you will see that although computational specificity and computational conservation are perfectly consistent, they're after kind of different approaches. Again, the idea of conservation is that the mind has this bag of tricks and it uses one of these tricks over and over again to solve different kinds of problems. The other thing you will note, hopefully, is that computational conservation says almost nothing about localizing these computations in the brain. It's a claim about how we can relate a given computational solution to our various cognitive capacities or to our psychological constructs. Of course, these get realized in the brain, and of course, this is something that we're going to want to return to. But I actually hope that, as you will see in the methodological kind of last part of my talk, we can do a lot of revisionary work over cognitive ontologies or psychological cognitive ontologies directly through a kind of computational approach, will actually improve our success when we then want to look to localizing these revised cognitive capacities in the brain. So when you start looking at it this way, you start to get these methodological breadcrumbs. When you see computational conservation occurring in the brain, you start to think, okay, hang on. It may be possible then, if I have this returning or recurring computation, as I mentioned in that web of knowledge, to kind of hold that part constant, right? And see how valuation is then implicated in these cognitive capacities, and see if we can learn something new about these cognitive capacities and our characterizations of them by holding valuation constant, and see what that tells us about our various cognitive capacities. And what I want to suggest in the last part of my talk is that we can have slow, extremely slow, and you'll see how slow, systematic revision of our understanding of certain cognitive capacities, and by extension of our cognitive ontologies, by using this method. But we'll see that it involves basically both informing in some cases and revising in other cases our existing understanding of certain cognitive capacities. And the example that I'm going to use here to illustrate how this methodological revision might work is actually a happy coincidence with Brian's talk, where I'm going to be looking at the relationship between valuation and attention. So it has been argued, especially by predictive coders, that valuation just is attention, and I've written elsewhere and argued elsewhere that that's just not the case. Valuation and attention are distinct, and this is really important because, as you can see, over the past maybe 6 or 10 years now, there's just been a raft of evidence suggesting that valuation, in fact, plays a defining role in attention. We attend to things that are rewarding, to stimuli that are rewarding, and we attend to stimuli that are valuable, and we attend to stimuli that are punishing, right? And we can use this information. So if we can now hold valuation constant, we can actually learn some things about how we think about attention. And here I have 2 cases. How much time do I have left given the internet wobble?
I'm not sure how much time do you need?
Like 5 minutes?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So I was going to say I can chop one case, but I won't do that. I'll actually look at both cases because I think it gives us a nice contrast. So in some cases, looking at the relation between the 2 constructs is just a process of enrichment. It's not a process of revision or replacement or anything like that. It just says, hey, these pieces seem to fit together. We have something like theoretical consilience here. And the example that I think kind of fills this category is Wayne Wu's selection for action theory of attention. So Wayne's view of attention is that attention is there to solve what he calls the many problem, right? We have many inputs, we have many possible outputs, many possible sort of relevant actions, and the function of attention is to kind of help reduce the many problems. So Wayne gives us a nice definition, right? S's attention to X is S's selection of X so as to solve the many problem present to S at T, namely selection of X inherent in S is traversing a specific path in the available behavioral space at T. Now, Wayne's account is there to specify attention. So what I'm about to say is not a knock in any way. Rather, it's meant to show that things can work together when you hold certain computations constant. You might look at Wayne's attention and think, okay, this makes sense of what the function of attention is. But what is selection there, right? What is it actually, how does the selection of attention work? We're selecting to attend to something, but how? My suggestion is that valuation may be the computational solution, or if you want to use the language of mechanism, for selection here. So we can kind of supplement the definition. Hopefully Wayne wouldn't be too mad about this, right? We can define attention as follows. S's attention to X is S's selection, conditional on the subpersonal attribution of reward and value over that kind of experience landscape to X so as to solve the many problem, right? So at the outset, I said, look, we can use computational conservation to inform our understanding of certain cognitive capacities. And I take this to be one such case, right? If you buy this picture, then you start to think, okay, I know what attention is, and I also know how one new piece of that might work because we have kind of consilience between them. Now, in the last minute or so of my talk, I just want to show you a case that's slightly more revisionary. Here I want to look at a different kind of class of theories of attention. They're sometimes called mental spotlight, or more recently and generously called location theories of attention, right? People love to crap on spotlight theories of attention, maybe rightly, but location is a bit more kind of reasonable, right? Location plays a huge role in our understanding of attention, and Moll doesn't defend this view, but he describes it nicely for us. A stimulus' location ultimately determines whether or not that stimulus receives attention. So on this view, attention is not about selection, it's about location. And a very nice instance of this theory is put forward in Pessoa's book from 2013, where he says, look, we have these maps, we have visual maps of what we attend to, and then certain features kind of feed into those maps, where those features are stimulus salience, endogenous relevance, affective significance, and motivational significance. Right, so they all kind of filter into understanding our picture of location, and that's what drives our attention. Now, if you look back to some of that evidence that in fact reward and value guide attention, right? What you might want to suggest is a slight revision of this category of theory of attention, which is that location and salience are proxies for reward. We look to certain areas, for example, this region of the face, because this is typically kind of a rewarding, informationally rewarding location of the face. Similarly, we tend to look at bright colors because over our evolutionary history, right, they have been rewarding, even though now in the form of candy, they absolutely are not. Now, I want to emphasize that this isn't kind of a monomaniacal theory where we're just going to revise and everything is valuation, attention is just valuation. No, of course not, because we learn that location and salience and perhaps other factors are placeholders for reward, and they can kind of become dissociated. But I want to suggest that rather than putting location as kind of the basis of attention and you have a priority map, what you have is a priority matrix, where reward plays an important role, evaluation plays an important role, but there can be hangovers into location independently, there can be hangovers into salience independently, but what you fundamentally want to do is kind of shift or slightly revise your understanding of what's going on in attention so that it can fit with the data that valuation plays a role in attention and how that might work. So the last thing I kind of want to suggest is that some of these revisions are going to be very minor or even just mutually informative, as I suggested with the selection for action view. Other cases, things like desire, are probably going to, if we use this approach, experience a lot of revision, if not elimination. right? So attention is very nicely specified in the philosophical and psychological literature. It has a fairly stable profile. We kind of understand what's going on in attention more or less, even though we might disagree. Things that are less clearly specified, like desire or motivation, once we kind of figure out what role valuation plays in them, may be revised far more dramatically, which will then actually impact kind of the face or the landscape of our cognitive ontologies in more substantial ways. But just to kind of wrap up, what I've suggested is that valuation is one example of a class of computational solution that gets used again and again and again for various kinds of problems. This suggests to us that we have something like computational conservation in the brain. And if that's right, then we can start to hold those conserved computations constant and use them to gently revise our intuitions and our understanding of certain cognitive capacities to start kind of working at the edges of our cognitive ontologies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia. We have more than 10 minutes for question. Please, if you have a question, write your name in the Q&A box by click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, as usual. Anyone has a question? If not, I will start while some of you are okay, Adina, go for it, and then I'll be next.
I'm wondering whether, I think that valuation is a really nice example. I wonder whether you have other things in mind, and also whether there's a lot of work recently about thinking about computation of, let's say, visual in object recognition, looking at multidimensional spaces, and I'm wondering, that's not really a computation, it's more of a framework for thinking about computation, and I wonder whether you think this plays some role in your sort of story, or whether that's not really a computation in the way you're conceiving of it.
Yeah, so my answer to the first part may actually help answer the second part. So I think that, there's kind of this classic division between people who are like, it's all reward, and there are other people who are like, it's all statistics, and it's probably both, right? We know that even dopamine now seems to track not just reward, but also statistical distribution. And I would suspect that the brain reuses its statistical bag of tricks again and again and again to solve all kinds of statistical problems across sensory modalities, across perceptual modalities, and so on. And I think there are good evolutionary reasons for thinking that even in simple organisms, right, some of these things work, and then as you might get more complex, obviously that's a very loaded claim, you just redeploy that same statistical solution or set of solutions to solve various kinds of statistical predictions, for example, in language. So, I don't think valuation plays a role in language production, in the selection of which words to speak next. I imagine that or I would argue that that's a kind of much more statistically described project, and we see that now in AI, right, as well. I bet you that over our evolutionary history, we have borrowed that or set of solutions from other statistical problems that the brain is solving kind of lower down. If that answers your question, I think that might be kind of a clue to answering the second question, right? So there are frameworks for understanding what's going on in the brain, and it's confusing because we call them computational solutions, and then we also think that the brain is doing some kind of computational work, and I think, yeah, we could be a lot clearer about that. But I think that I'm kind of do I want to say this? I think that some of our mathematical models captures, I was going to use the R word and I won't, but I think that the mathematical models are approximating or starting to look at what's actually going, kinds of problem solving that the brain is performing. And so even though they are for us theoretical or scientific methodologies or frameworks, in some cases they might get at things that can be mathematically described that are actually happening in the brain. And in that sense, yes, I think that the brain is performing computations in that sense, even though we're describing them in computations using this other sense, if that's what you were kind of putting pressure on.
Yeah, can I follow up, Edward?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. So I'm actually surprised that you backed off of valuation as being important in let's say, language production, because I think you might think that one transition between this sort of statistical framework and valuation framework is that, high statistical relevance is some sort of valuation. So I'm wondering whether you could just expand on that a little bit, why you didn't want to go there.
Yeah, I think deficits don't bear it out. So I think you have, so at first I didn't expect valuation at all to play the role that it does in vision, for example. So I was surprised one way, and then was kind of relieved when I found out that it doesn't, I think, play a role in things like language. And the reason that I think this is the case is because you have patients who have damage in their reward system, let's say through accident, and you immediately see damage in motor control. So kind of the classic things you see in Parkinson's, for example, right? Trouble with visual fixation, trouble with planning, trouble with probabilities, trouble with motor, of course, mood, right? All you kind of see that the spine of valuation kind of break down across the board in something like Parkinson's or Tourette's. Not reading comprehension, not language production. So it's a very empirical claim. Obviously, like Chris Moll always like, be monomaniacal, valuation is everything. It's a lot. It's kind of a surprising a lot, but it's not everything, I think, because those seem untouched other than through the planning components. And again, thank God, because that would just be nuts for me, I think. Thanks.
All right, so I'll ask a quick question, and then Brian has a question as well. And it's sort of a clarification question about how reward is connected to the other dimension that for you matters for attention. So you don't have a monolithic theory of the cues for attention. Reward is one, and salience and location seem to matter for you as well. But now we know from tons of evolutionary inspired research that negatively balanced objects are high cues for attention. There's all this classic work by Mineka on snake recognition. There's also all the work by whatever his name in France, in Toulouse, on a super fast categorization of animals in contrast to artifacts, which of course from an evolutionary point of view, so less than 400 milliseconds, you're able to recognize and classify animals into their proper kind, at least, cat-shaped animals and bird-shaped animals, that kind of thing. And it's clearly partly negatively balanced, right? So how does that exactly work? So on your views, it should be low in attracting attention because except if you have somewhat definition of reward that's distinct from the personal level dimensions that are captured, but they're very salient and highly captured by attention. So I'd like you to hear a bit more about the details there.
Yeah, you're gonna hate the answer to this, right? Because the way it's defined is it's just negative reward. So reward in this technical sense can be a positive number or a negative number. And of course, all of these things are, as you said, very negatively valenced. And so I think around that, you can tell a very nice kind of evolutionary just so story, right? It's kind of, we've evolved to have very negative association, or, to find it very rewarding from an informational perspective to attend to rustling, to sudden movements, right? All of our sort of attention capture. So it doesn't have to be rewarding in the cup of coffee sense. It can be punishing, i.e. extremely negatively rewarding in the, in Australia, we were there together, right? Every stick is a snake because you're like, oh God, that's a snake. Oh God, that's a snake.
Well, you're right.
Yeah. So it's just a negative number.
I thought about this possible response. I do worry a little bit about the circularity there. Mm-hmm. Whatever capture attention is going to have, I'd like them to have an independent measure of what's positively rewarding. You don't want to be in a situation where somehow you don't have an independent measure of reward. That would be great if you could just tell me what this is for snakes.
So I don't know about snakes, but there is some nice work by Christoph Koch, who has tried to separate out kind of a three-way relation between salience in the flashy color sense of salience, reward, and the costliness of that statistical distribution. So that's kind of why I was suggesting that, again, I don't want to go full monomaniacal. I want it to be a matrix where obviously we offload some of this learning. We've, through evolution, offloaded snakes, and we're just like, you know, snakes are not worth relearning, folks. And we just offload that. And so I think there is some work that's already trying to kind of hold the valuation constant and see, okay, what part of it is salience, what part of it is, you know, statistical probability, and what part of it is reward, and kind of seeing that they do come apart. It's just that in nature they're so often clumped. Yeah.
Good. Thanks. That's really helpful.
But
Brian.
not location. I will vote that it's not location.
Okay. Good. Thanks. Brian, go for it.
Yeah, thanks for that talk. It's very fascinating. I'm glad I got a chance to listen to it. I'm wondering about you. So you gave the great example of coffee in the morning versus coffee at night. And I'm wondering if you've thought more about, or if you could talk more about the notion of context. I've tried to think of, in thinking through effortless attention, I've tried to think of how we develop a sensitivity to cues within domains. So if you're of activity, so if you're learning a sport, for instance, you get more and more sensitive to different cues of the activity as you get better and better at it, and responsive to those cues, which suggests that there's a sort of a web of interconnection among cues within a context. And then you shift to another context. There may be similar stimuli, but they would be in a different kind of web of relations. Have you given any thought to how valuation works across contexts, and what a context is?
Yeah, so there's a cheap answer and a gross answer. So I'll go with the cheap answer first. The cheap answer is, right, that we're very good at mapping something like state action pairs. So suppose that the world comes labeled or broken into, as you say, you know, cues, into units. The mind is very good, and our mathematical models are very good at then assigning rewards to those units, to those states, or as you would call them, cues, and recognizing those cues elsewhere and carrying over the reward or value that was assigned to them. Cheap answer. Messy answer is, of course, that the mathematical models basically assume this parcellation in advance. And that's, again, another reason why you don't want valuation to be the solution to everything. It's almost completely silent on the question of how do you parcellate the world to then assign rewards and values. And I think there, again, probably some of the statistical methods come in. This is, you know, coming from the AI side of things. This is why we're now blending methods, right? We're blending deep machine learning and reinforcement learning, because we're trying to capture both the parcellation and the reward attribution features of those. So depending on which way to take your question, that's like a very, that is originally a very dissatisfying answer, but yeah, that's how I would tend to think about it.
So just to follow up, by deep machine learning, you mean that we have no idea what the ontology is?
The ontology of which? The world?
Whatever is happening in that instance.
I think lots of people have good ideas about that. I'm not one of those people. So I'm much more interested in how the reward that then gets attributed. For example, there are lots of people in Pittsburgh that think just about this question: how do we break up, a true unit, a true parcel versus a false parcel? And there are all kinds of interesting models for that. My branch is like, those are great. You should also think about this other part of the story. But there's lots of good work done, for example, at CMU on this stuff.
All right, thank you very much, Brian. I think we are reaching the end of our meetings. There's probably time for one last question if someone wants to have one. There's someone from anonymous attendee, but because it's anonymous attendee, I don't know who that is. That's a tricky. It's a tricky call. Okay, if there's no other question, we will stop here for today. Thank you, Brian, and thank you, Julia, for these great talks. Remember, the next meeting of the Cognitive Ontology Seminar is Thursday next week at 10 a.m. With the talk by Jackie Sullivan. And if you have not registered, you can register online on the center's website. Go to the calendar and find the link there. Adina, do you want to add something?
Nope, I think you've said it all.
All right.
I do want to thank our speakers, though, Julia and Brian. Thank you very much for two really interesting talks.
All right, guys. Bye. Thank you very much for these talks.
Bye.
Take care.
Stay well.